I thank the Prime Minister for his valuable guidance. I now begin the first session of the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting. As I do so, Excellencies, let us remind ourselves that this grouping bears an exceptional responsibility. We first came together in the midst of a global crisis and are today, once again, actually confronting multiple ones. These include the impact of the COVID pandemic, concerns of fragile supply chains, the knock-on effects of ongoing conflicts, anxiety of debt crisis, and the disruption of climate change.
All right, so this, of course, is the Foreign Ministers Summit that is presently underway in New Delhi. We are getting more details as they emerge on this developing story. Remember, this of course, is going to be a crucial meeting of the foreign ministers. And one of the key aspects that will, of course, come up for discussion over and over again is, of course, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, India so far, remember, has not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it has stated that the time for war and expansionism is pretty much over. And India's Prime Minister, in his address, also flagged off the deep divisions that exist in the world at this point of time. The G20 is a very important gathering of nations. This, of course, is the gathering of the top 20 economies of the world. It pulls a lot of weight, but the question, of course, is G20 now a house divided? Or can G20 arrive at some kind of a consensus on some of these pressing issues that are faced by the world? Remember, the foreign ministers are all here in New Delhi. There was the meeting of the finance ministers, which was held in Bengaluru just a few days back. But the controversy there was that there was no joint communique that was issued because the finance ministers meeting could not come to a consensus on a joint statement. And therefore, that, of course, remains a key sticking point. This is something that will be watched very carefully. Will there be a joint communique? In the aftermath of this foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi is something that is still up for a lot of discussion. But the Indian Prime Minister in his address has stated that sustainable development goals will, of course, be a key part of the agenda. America's Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the British Foreign Minister James Cleverly, the Turkish Foreign Minister, they're all here in New Delhi and they're trying to arrive at a consensus. But is that going to be possible? Is, of course, something that we'll find out over the course of the next few hours. And my colleague Siddhant Sibil is presently tracking all the developments that are unfolding at the Foreign Ministers meeting in New Delhi. And Siddhant, if you can hear me, this, of course, is a crucial day for the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting that is unfolding in New Delhi. Bring us up to speed with what's happening there.
Well, Mohammed, today is, of course, a hectic day. Delhi is the diplomatic capital of the world, and we heard what the Prime Minister said, that focus on what unites us and not divides us. And basically, he talked about geopolitical tensions, which, of course, he means the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, and pointed out that everyone have their own perspective. But the basic emphasis by the Prime Minister was on the needs of the developing world. He said it's the developing world that is taking the brunt of the crisis. He talked about challenges like climate change and how India is trying to be the voice of the Global South. Remember, in the month of January, India hosted the Voice of the Global South Summit, and that feeds into today's meeting. But nonetheless, the focus for India, as outlined by the Indian Prime Minister, essentially is that, remember that while there is a divide between West and Russia, it is the developing world that is facing...
Absolutely, Siddhant, I need to interrupt you there because India's Foreign Minister S Jaishankar is just addressing the media. Let's listen in as to what he's saying.
Today's situation demands that we continue to live up to our international responsibilities. The G20 must be sensitive to the priorities and economic concerns of all our partners, especially those more vulnerable. We must ensure demand-driven and sustainable development cooperation based on country ownership and transparency. Respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity are essential guiding principles for such cooperation. Excellencies, as G20 foreign ministers, we can send a collective message affirming our determination to address the complex challenges that we face at this juncture.
All right, so that was India's Foreign Minister S Jaishankar there, stating that it is important for nations that have arrived for them to all pull together in the same direction. Because at this moment the world is deeply divided. There are several issues that have plagued international politics. The key among them is, of course, the war in Ukraine. And apart from this, the elephant in the room that a lot of people seem not to be talking about are the tensions between the United States and China. This, of course, will also play a big role in terms of how all of this will, of course, unfold in New Delhi. Because remember, the foreign ministers of each of these nations are here. Sergei Lavrov from Russia is here. China's foreign minister is also here. And it remains to be seen as to how the foreign ministers will, of course, interact with each other and what will be the upshot of it. India, of course, is the chair of the G20 this year. This is, of course, a big grouping. The grouping of the top 20 economies of the world that pulls a lot of weight, both economically and politically. What role can India play? This is something that India has been working on very, very closely. Now, India is the chair of the G20 this year. It is trying to bring all of these nations together. It is, of course, trying to play the role one expects of a country that can facilitate all of these nations to, of course, put their heads together to try and arrive at some kind of consensus. My colleague Siddhant Sibal is still standing by with us. Siddhant, this is what the Indian Foreign Minister S Jaishankar also said, that this, of course, is a very challenging time for the world. And it is important for the leaders at this moment to, in fact, all arrive at a consensus, because conflict is not a solution for the problems that plague our planet Earth at this moment.
Well, India will be hoping to get a consensus when it comes to issues which, of course, are the elephant in the room, as you pointed out. That's the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But as the both Indian Prime Minister and the External Affairs Minister pointed out, the focus should be on issues that unite us, that is the world, than divide us. But what is interesting to point out is that the Indian Prime Minister mentioned issues like the debt crisis. Now, that is a worrisome feature in today's world. Almost 70 countries are in some way facing the problem. In our neighborhood, Sri Lanka and Pakistan are examples of how the debt crisis is something that is impacting the economy. So essentially, India will be focusing on that. And there are, of course, reports saying that India is keen that countries, especially the largest economies, take haircut when it comes to their support when it comes to the debt crisis issue. And that is something that could be contentious, especially for countries like China, who have been held responsible for the debt crisis. But India will be focusing on being the voice of the global south, as the Indian Prime Minister several times pointed out, to issues facing the developing countries, issues like climate change, issues like counterterrorism, and issues like the increase in the prices of food, fuel and commodity prices, something we have heard for last 1 year several times from the global south. So it's the global south that India is going to prioritize, even as it calls on the Western world and Russia to come together on the same page for the sake of the international community, because there are several other issues that needs to be dealt with. And it's the poorest country and the poorest man on the street on these countries which faces the problem of various the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Indeed. And also, Siddhant, if you can shed some light on this, because this is something that has been talked about for quite some time before the foreign ministers even arrived in New Delhi. Now, Anthony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, has now made it clear that he'll not be meeting the Russian and the Chinese representatives at the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting. Do you expect, at least, would there be a pull aside? You know, there does not need to be a bilateral meeting of sorts. Could there be a pull aside, and could these leaders exchange a few words?
Well, it looks highly unlikely given the shrillness from both sides, from the Western world and, of course, the Russian side. We know that what has been transpiring when it comes to the Americans and the Chinese, the Americans and the Russians. So any kind of engagement, even a handshake, will make an international headline. But it's highly unlikely, even though they are right now, even as we speak. In fact, I'm just standing in front of that very place at the Rashtrapati Bhavan, where the foreign Ministers meeting is taking place. That place behind me is the place where the Foreign Ministers meeting is right now underway. But as I said, it is highly unlikely that any kind of handshake or a pull aside is possible. But one thing is for sure, that the world is trying to quote with India, trying to engage with India. There are two key bilaterals. The Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S Jaishankar has one at 11:30 a.m. with the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. That's a key engagement. And then, of course, at 12 noon local time here in Delhi, he will be meeting the new Foreign Minister of China. Remember that there have been one visit by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the previous Foreign Minister, after the Galwan incident last year. And now this is the second Chinese Foreign Minister visit happening, but first by the new Chinese Foreign Minister. So essentially that meeting is something that will be closely watched by everyone as to what transpires, and will it impact the ongoing sentiment in the India-China relationship that has seen a southward trajectory, that has seen a decline.
Absolutely indeed. And my final question to you, Siddhant, before we let you go to track more developments for us, is this. India is, of course, the chair of the G20 this year. India has got a clear plan in terms of how it intends to take the G20 forward. The question, of course, is this. Can India get these top 20 economies of the world to, in fact, pull together in the same direction? Or, as the Indian Prime Minister pointed out, that at this moment, it appears that multilateralism in global politics is in danger. Is that something that you also agree with?
Well, Prime Minister's opening comments had this one line, that the global governance has failed, and the failure of the global governance is felt most by the countries of the global south, the developing countries. So essentially that sums up the feeling of New Delhi towards multilateral organization, that the multilateral organizations are stuck in a world of 1940s and not of this century. And that is something that India has been hoping to change, that reforms need to happen immediately on an urgent basis, especially at the United Nations, at the United Nations Security Council. We know that India today is the 5th largest economy, has overtaken the United Kingdom, and soon will be the world's most populated country. Now, this country looks to have all the credentials to be on the high table, but yet there is the internal dynamics. Countries like China who are opposed to India's presence at the high table, its global geopolitics, its global power dynamics, and that is something that India wants to change. So essentially it is the global governance, it is the reform of the multilateral institution that India wants to take forward, especially at the G20. In fact, G20 is a prime example of how the UN has failed. It's because of the failure of the UN that groupings like G20 arose after 2008 financial crisis, and now are taking political role as well.
Absolutely indeed, Siddhant. Thank you very much indeed for joining us and getting us all those updates from New Delhi there. We'll of course come back to you as more details emerge through the day. This of course is a crucial meeting of the foreign ministers of the G20 grouping that of course is taking place this moment in New Delhi. And it remains to be seen as to what, of course, will be the upshot of it. Because remember, at this point of time, G20 pulls a lot of weight. It is the gathering of the top 20 economies in the world. Politically, this is very significant. But these foreign ministers are meeting at a time when the world is deeply divided. And it remains to be seen whether there'll be a joint communique. Because just remember, last week, when the finance ministers of the G20 met in Bengaluru, in southern India, there was no joint communique. But will there be a joint communique this time? That, of course, is what remains to be seen. The foreign ministers of these top 20 economies will be sitting on the same table across each other. They'll be talking about a whole host of different issues. But Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State for America, has said that there will not be a meeting between him and the foreign ministers of Russia and China, who are also present, who will be present in the same hall. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.